Hello all, welcome back to FED Learning. In our previous video, we created a reducer and successfully rendered initial data in the Redux dev tool. Now let's dive into the actual NgRx flow with a practical example from scratch. And we have already covered the principles of NgRx in the introduction, so let's apply those concepts to build a counter example. I'll open Visual Studio Code editor and let's create a simple counter example to demonstrate the NgRx flow. So for that, inside app.component.html file, I'll go ahead and restructure the document. Here I'm taking one div with class text center, and I'll shift this heading inside this div. And I'll update this class with text primary. I'm adding one HR tag, and then inside h2 element, I'm adding text app counter colon. I'll bind a counter variable using string interpolation. And I'm creating the same counter variable inside class file of the same component, counter of type number equals to 0. And now again I'll go back to the template file, and after this h2 element I'm taking one more div, and inside this div I'm adding 3 buttons for increment, decrement and reset the counter with bootstrap class btn, btn success and margin 2. Button name is increment. Also, I'll add the click event equals to I'll assign function on increment. Now I am creating 2 more buttons, one for decrement and one for reset. For decrement, I'll update the function with on decrement, and for reset, I'll update the function with on reset. Also, I am changing the button color to btn warning and btn secondary. Now let's define these 3 functions inside the class file on increment, on decrement and on reset. And in on increment function, we will increment the counter by 1, counter plus plus. Similarly, in the on decrement function, we will decrement the counter by 1, counter minus minus. And in the on reset function, we will assign the counter value to 0. Okay. Now save the changes and let's run the project using command ngserve. And once I navigate to the localhost 4200, as we can see 3 buttons, increment, decrement and reset. And once I click on the increment button, the value of app counter is incrementing, and clicking on the decrement button, the value of app counter is decrementing. Similarly, if I click on the reset button, the counter is resetting to 0. It means our counter functionality is working as expected. Now next, I'll create 2 new components using command ngGenerate component, component name admin, and another component ngGenerate component, component name user. And after creating these 2 components, I'll add the selector of these 2 components inside app component.html file. So here I'll take one more HR, and after that inside div with class row, inside this row I'll add one more class call 6, and inside this I'll add the selector of app user and app admin component. So now user and admin components are the child component of the app component. Let me import these 2 components inside the imports array of the app component class file. Admin component comma user component. Now if I navigate to the browser, we can see the user component as well as admin component. And now I want to display this updated counter value in these 2 components along with the app component. So in such scenario, we can make use of NgRx. Also, while learning Angular 19, I covered component communication exploring 5 different approaches. If you want to recap, you can find the detailed explanation in my Angular 19 series. The link is available in the description below. However, in this NgRx series, we will focus on using NgRx to share the counter value from parent component to child components. And to achieve this, we will follow a step-by-step approach. But instead of diving straight into the code, let's first understand what are the steps we need to follow. Because by understanding the process, you will be able to create your own examples using the same steps. Let me open the PPT and let's explore the steps to implement Angular state management with NgRx. So the first step is to create actions. In NgRx, actions represent events that trigger state changes. For example, user interaction API call, or we can say form submission, logins, or data retrieval. Like in our counter example, we will define three actions, one for incrementing, one for decrementing, and one for resetting the count. Okay. Next step is to create a reducer. After dispatching an action, the reducer is triggered to update the state. And it takes the current state and the action as a inputs, applies the necessary logic, and returns a new state object. In our case, the reducer will contain the logic for incrementing, decrementing, and resetting the counter based on the actions dispatched. Next step is configure the store. In this step, we will register the reducer in the app configuration file, effectively storing the state in the NgRx store. And this setups the store to manage the application state using the reducer's logic. Next step is to create selectors. Selectors are functions that allows components to retrieve specific slices of a state from the NgRx store. And they provide a way for components to access the state they need, making it easier to manage and reuse the state logic. Next step is to define an interface. This step is optional but recommended. To ensure type safety, it's good practice to define an interface for the state instead of using generic type any. So this step helps to catch type related errors at compile time and makes the code more maintainable. And the last step is to dispatch action and update the UI. So in this step, we will dispatch the actions we have created, which will trigger the reducer to update the state. And the components will then use selectors to retrieve the updated state and reflect the changes in the UI. So with this, we have gone over the 6 steps for working with NgRx Store. Now let's put them into practice. Switching back to the Visual Studio Code Editor, and let's implement these steps in our counter example. First, inside state folder, let me create one more folder called counter, and we will use this counter folder for the counter feature. And as per our first step, I'll add a new file inside this counter folder called counter.action.ts. And inside this file, we will define and export actions using the create action function from the NgRx store. So first we will create an increment action. For that, I'll write export constant increment equals to, I'll use the function create action and make sure it will import from NgRx store. Now inside this create action function, we need to specify the action type as a string. So here inside single quotes, I'll write counter inside square bracket space increment. Okay. So inside this single quote, you can add anything related to increment action. But here I have added counter inside the square bracket and space increment. This indicates that the action belongs to the counter feature and is triggered when the user wants to increment the counter. Okay. Now I'll follow the same approach to create decrement and reset action. So here instead of increment, I'll write decrement, and here also instead of increment, I'll write decrement. In this case also, this decrement action belongs to the counter feature and it is triggered when the user wants to decrement the count. And last is for reset. Here I'll write reset the counter. Okay. So this is our first step to create action. Now the second step is to create the reducer. And for that, I'll again create a new file called counter.reducer.ts. And inside this file, first we should start by defining and exporting the initial state. So here I'll write export constant initial state equals to, I'll set 0 for our counter. Initially, I want to set my counter to 0. Now next, we will create a reducer function. For that, I'll again write export constant and name of the reducer function is counter reducer equals to. Now here, I'll use the create reducer function from NgRx Store. Make sure to import create reducer function from NgRx Store. Remember, we need to define actions with create action function and reducer with create reducer function. Now this create reducer function takes the initial state as the first parameter. Here you can see initial state of type unknown and followed by one or more on functions from NgRx Store that specifies how to handle specific actions. So here I'll write first parameter as the initial state, comma, and then on function, which is also imported from NgRx Store. And inside this on function, we need to specify the action type. So our action type is increment, comma. Next, we need to add the handler function that updates the state. So inside bracket, I'll add state, arrow function, and state plus 1. So it means when this increment action is dispatched, this handler function will call the current state as an argument and returns a new state value by incrementing it to 1. After this, we can add comma and include additional on functions for decrement and reset. For decrement, I'll write state minus 1 and we need to import this decrement from the counter.action file. Similarly, I'll write for reset and for reset, I'll set the initial value that is 0. This also we need to import from the counter.action. Okay, reset action returns the initial value which is 0. So this is the code we have to write inside the reducer file for the counter functionality. And with that, we have completed the first two steps, creating actions and reducers. Now let's move on to the third step, registering the state in the appconfig.ts file. And this is an important step in setting up the store. So I'll open the appconfig.ts file and here let's register the counter register in the same way we registered the EMP reducer using a key value pair where the key represents the state name and the value is the corresponding reducer. So in this case, I'll write the key as a counter colon. Our reducer name is counter reducer. Let me paste the counter reducer here and we need to import it from reducer file. Okay, so this is how we can register our reducer. And registering the reducer with provide store tells NgRx to create a store with the counter state and use the counter reducer to manage the counter state. So now we have created the state for the counter reducer. So we should see this counter state in the Redux dev tool. So let me go back to the Chrome browser and here let me inspect this page. We need to navigate to the Redux dev tool and here we can see the counter state under the state tab. Okay, so this is our third step. Now let's move on to the fourth step, using selectors to retrieve data from the store. So in the app.component.ts file, I'll comment out this counter variable and I'll create a new observable counter variable of type observable number. And let me comment out this counter increment, decrement, and resetting. Okay. After this creating the observable variable, we need to inject the store through the constructor. So let me add constructor here, private store of type store, which is imported from NgRx Store. And now here we need to specify the data type of the counter variable. So here we can specify any, but instead of using the any data type, we will define an interface for the store. So inside this counter folder, I'll create one more file called counter.store.ts. And I'll use this file for creating an interface. So here I'll export interface, and the interface name I'll write iCounter. Inside this interface, I'll define the variable counter of type number. Now, inside app.component.ts file, instead of using the any data type, I'll specify the interface name iCounter. And inside this constructor, I'll write this dot counter equals to, here I'll use the select method of the store. This dot store dot select, and inside this method, we need to pass counter as an variable. So once you press the control plus space, it will show you suggestions. So I'll write counter. Okay. So with this, we have completed our fourth and fifth step, that is creating selector and defining an interface. Now the final step is to dispatch an action and update the UI. Inside on increment, on decrement, and on reset function, let's use the store dispatch method to call the respective action. So here this dot store dot dispatch, and inside this method we need to specify the action. So for increment we will use increment action. Okay. Similarly for decrement I'll use the decrement action, and for reset we need to use the reset action. So here instead of increment I'll write reset, which is imported from counter.action file. Here you can see the increment, decrement, and reset actions imported from counter.action file. Okay. Now last, we need to map this counter variable with template file. So for that, we can use async pipe or subscribe to the observable to get the latest state. So here inside imports array, I'll add the async pipe and use the same pipe to bind the counter variable with template file. So here instead of counter, I'll write counter dollar pipe symbol and async pipe. And with this, we have now completed all 6 steps of the implementation. Let's revisit the browser and test the counter functionality for the app component. So here you can see I am clicking on the increment button. The app counter is incrementing by 1. And once I click on the decrement, it is decrementing by 1. Similarly, click on the reset button, it is resetting to 0. Here also you can see the counter state is updating as per the user interaction. Okay. So it confirms that our NgRx Store implementation is working correctly. Now next, we have the user and admin component set. And we want to display this updated counter value in both component, user as well as admin component. And to do this, we can simply copy the counter variable and the constructor from this app.component.ts file and open the user component ts file as well as admin component ts file and paste the same code inside both the files. And don't forget to import the async pipe or other required dependencies. So let me import it quickly. iCounter, we need to import from counter.store.ts file, and here we need to import the async pipe. Okay, same I need to do inside the admin component. I'll open the class file of admin component and I'll paste the same counter variable and constructor. And here also I'll import the async pipe. Now next we need to bind this counter variable to the respective component template files. So let's copy this h2 from app component.html file. And let me open the user component template file, and here I'll take one div with class text center, and inside this I'll paste the h2 element, and I'll update the counter. This is user component counter, so I'll update the app with user. And inside admin component template file I'll paste the same HTML code and update the component name admin. Save the changes. And now let's test this in the browser. Let me click on the increment button, decrement, and reset. And we can see the updated counter value in all three components: app component, user component, and admin component. Okay, so let's quickly recap all 6 steps. Let me close all these files. And what we did in first step, we have created 3 actions inside counter.action.ts file: increment, decrement, and reset. And then we created a reducer and added the respective logic for all 3 actions. Next, we register the reducer inside app.config.ts file with eValue pair. After that, we created an interface called iInterface for type safety. Then inside app.component.ts file, used this store select method. And after that, we dispatched the 3 actions using store dispatch method and bound this counter variable with the template file using the async pipe. And finally, we used a selector to display the updated counter values in the admin and user components. And this example demonstrates a parent-child component relationship. But by injecting the store in the constructor, we can access the updated counter value anywhere in the application. So the benefit of using NgRx is the state is stored in a single place, making it easier to manage. Hope you understand this counter example with NgRx. And if you enjoyed my content, please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for visiting FED Learning and supporting my channel's growth. Thank you. Bye bye.